What would you do if, moments before takeoff, you were told to give up your rightful first-class seat, not for safety, but for someone else's comfort? Would you move quietly, avoiding conflict, or would you stay knowing every eye in the cabin was on you, waiting to see if you'd yield for Dr. Camille Rhodes, a poised and respected black CEO? That moment came on what should have been a routine flight from Phoenix to Seattle. The request sounded official, a weight and balance issue. The captain insisted, but the empty seat beside her told another story. Behind her, a wealthy couple smirked, their whispers laced with entitlement. And across the aisle, phones began to record. This was no longer just about a seat. It was about dignity, power, and the unspoken rules that tell some people they don't belong. Camille knew that her choice in the next few minutes would ripple far beyond this cabin. So, what happens when the wrong woman says no? And what price will others pay for underestimating her if you believe respect should never be negotiable? Hit like, share this story, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's step onto the plane. The late afternoon sun poured through the towering glass walls of Phoenix Skyport International, painting the terminal floor in streaks of gold. The air carried a mix of scents, freshly brewed coffee from a kiosk nearby, faint jet fuel from the tarmac, and that clean, recycled coolness of airport air conditioning. Dr. Camille Rhodes moved through it all with a quiet purpose. Her rolling carry-on clicked lightly over the polished tiles, her tailored navy blazer swaying with each step. It had been a week of grueling negotiations in Phoenix boardrooms where every sentence was measured, every gesture observed. As CEO of Rhodes Global Strategies, Camille was no stranger to pressure. She'd stood before corporate boards with billions on the line. She'd advised governments on crisis response. Yet, now, all she wanted was silence. A quiet 2-hour flight to Seattle to regroup, to let her mind settle before Monday's leadership summit. At Gate C-14, the boarding process for Aeroluxair's charter service had already begun. Camille stepped forward, presenting her boarding pass with a polite smile. The gate agent, a young man with neatly combed hair, scanned it, then looked up. "Welcome aboard. Dr. Rhodes," he said warmly. "C2A. We're glad to have you." Camille nodded her thanks and walked the jet bridge, feeling the faint vibration of the idling engines underfoot. Inside the first-class cabin, the lighting was soft, the cream leather seats wide and inviting. She located 2A, a window seat near the front, stowed her bag in the overhead bin, and sat down with a slow exhale. The seat next to her, 2B, was empty. She allowed herself a small, private smile. Maybe she would have the space to herself. She had just begun scrolling through her phone when a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see a flight attendant, blonde hair pulled into a taut bun, a perfectly pressed uniform smiling in that way that wasn't quite a smile. "Dr. Rhodes," the woman asked. "Yes, my name is Marcy. We're going to need you to move seats." Camille blinked. "I'm sorry, it's a weight and balance issue," Marcy said, her voice even but carrying a hint of tension. "The captain insists." Camille's gaze slid to the seat beside her, still empty, then to the row behind, where a couple had just settled in Elliot Carraway, silver hair, tailored sport coat, and his wife Sloane, her blonde bob perfectly framed by oversized sunglasses perched on her head. They were watching, the corners of their mouths tilted in matching smirks. "And the seat next to me doesn't matter?" Camille asked, keeping her tone neutral. Marcy's eyes flickered toward the Carraways, then back. "The captain has his reasons." Sloane leaned toward Elliot, her voice pitched just enough to carry forward. "Some people are just so difficult," she said. Elliot chuckled. Something inside Camille cooled. She had been in enough rooms, enough situations, to recognize when the reason offered wasn't the real one, and she knew the difference between a request made in good faith and one meant to erase you from where you belong. "I'm comfortable here," Camille said evenly. "I'll be staying in my seat." The smile on Marcy's face stiffened. She hesitated, then nodded once. "I'll be right back," she said, turning sharply and walking up the aisle. The cabin settled into a taut silence. Camille kept her gaze on the window, the runway beyond shimmering in the heat, her reflection steady and composed. She could feel eyes on her, some curious, some calculating. The Carraways' hushed conversation drifted forward again. "This will be over in a second," Elliot murmured. "People like her don't want trouble." Camille's hand, resting lightly on the armrest, curled almost imperceptibly, a reminder to herself she was in control. 2 rows back, Andre Morales, Senior VP of Operations at Rhodes Global, watched with quiet focus. He knew Camille well enough to recognize this wasn't just about a seat. He also knew when to be ready to step in. A few minutes passed. The clink of glassware from the galley, the faint murmur of passengers chatting, a distant announcement echoing from the gate. Camille let it all fade, her mind slipping to memories she had no desire to relive, times she had been talked over in meetings, mistaken for support staff at conferences, introduced without her title while her male peers were announced with theirs. It was the same undertone here, just in a different uniform. Marcy returned, but she wasn't alone. Captain Roger Vance filled the aisle, his crisp white shirt and gold-striped epaulets broadcasting authority. He stopped at Camille's row, his expression polite but impatient. "Ma'am," he began, not quite meeting her eyes, "we need your cooperation for operational reasons. I'd rather not escalate this." Camille turned her head, met his gaze squarely. "You want to remove a paying first-class passenger for the comfort of others. At least have the decency to admit it." A muscle jumped in Vance's jaw. "The crew's decision is final." "Then make it official," Camille replied quietly. "Remove me in front of your passengers." From behind her, Sloane's amused exhale was almost theatrical. Elliot grinned, but Marcy's confidence seemed to waver. She glanced around, noticing more than one passenger now holding up a phone, recording. Captain Vance straightened. "We can discuss this after takeoff." "We can discuss it now," Camille said, her voice steady as stone. 2 rows back, Andre Morales closed his laptop. It was time to act. The cabin air felt heavier now, the kind of stillness that isn't silence at all, but rather the sound of people holding their breath. Camille could feel it pressing against her skin, not as heat, but as a subtle, electric pressure. She didn't move. Outside her window, a baggage cart rolled slowly past, the driver glancing up at the sleek nose of the Aerolux jet, unaware of the brewing storm inside. Sloane Carraway shifted in her seat behind Camille, crossing one leg over the other with a deliberate snap of movement. The faint scent of her perfume floated forward, sharp and expensive. Camille could hear the woman's voice again, pitched low but designed to carry. "Some people really don't know their place," Sloane murmured. It wasn't the words alone. It was the way they were delivered, not to start a fight, but to place a label, to make it clear to anyone listening that she thought Camille was out of bounds simply by sitting here. Elliot chuckled in agreement, the sound deep and self-satisfied. "Give it a minute. She'll move. They always do." Camille let her eyes remain fixed on the tarmac. On the way, the sun was beginning to edge toward the horizon. She had learned long ago that sometimes the strongest response was no visible reaction at all. Her pulse was steady, her breathing measured, but inside, something far older than this moment was stirring a tired, familiar frustration that had lived in her since she was a young woman navigating spaces where she was often the only one like her in the room. The first-class cabin door clicked as Marcy slipped back toward the galley, her shoes tapping softly on the aisle carpet. Camille's gaze followed her just long enough to see her lean toward another flight attendant, whisper something, then glance back toward Camille. The other attendant's brow furrowed in a way that suggested concern, but also hesitation. No one wanted to be in the middle of this. Camille thought about all the reasons she could give in. It would be easier, quicker, less disruptive. She could take a seat farther back, read her emails, and be in Seattle by dinner time. There would be no confrontation, no public scene, just another quiet compromise, another notch in the long ledger of moments when she'd chosen peace over principle. But she also knew the cost of those choices. Each one carved away at something inside you. Each one left a faint scar that no one else could see. A scar she had carried from the time a college professor had suggested she might be more comfortable in a different seminar. To the time a hotel concierge had assumed she was lost when she stepped into a private event she was headlining. Those moments never happened in isolation. They built upon each other, shaping the way you saw yourself and the way others thought they could treat you. She straightened slightly in her seat, as if to tell herself that this was not going to be one of those moments. From across the aisle, a man in his 50s wearing a charcoal suit and reading glasses looked up from his newspaper. Their eyes met briefly. His expression was unreadable, but he did not look away. He folded the paper slowly, as though signaling his awareness of what was unfolding. 2 rows back, Andre Morales set his tablet down on the tray table, pushing his chair slightly forward. He could see the line being drawn here, invisible but unmistakable. He'd seen Camille navigate high-stakes negotiations with heads of state without raising her voice. He knew her patience was formidable, but he also knew that patience could be mistaken for passivity by those who didn't understand her. The sound of heels returned. Marcy emerged from the galley with a practiced smile, but there was tension in the way she held her shoulders. "Dr. Rhodes," she began, "I want to assure you this is purely an operational matter. We're just trying to make sure everything is set for a safe flight." "And the empty seat next to me?" Camille asked quietly. Marcy's eyes darted toward 2B, still unoccupied. "It's about overall balance, not just this row." Camille's gaze didn't waver. "Then move them," she said, nodding toward the Caraways. Marcy blinked, the smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. "They're settled," she replied. Camille allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible shake of the head. "So am I." For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the air system and the muted clatter from the galley. Sloane's voice floated forward again, tinged with mock pity. "It's sad, really, making such a fuss." Camille didn't turn around. She didn't give Sloane the satisfaction. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap, a picture of composure, even as the heat of indignation burned quietly in her chest. She felt Andre's eyes on her, steady and supportive. He didn't speak. Not yet. He knew Camille well enough to recognize she was still deciding her next move, weighing not just the personal stakes but the message she would send to the crew, to the other passengers, to herself. Captain Vance's voice crackled briefly over the cabin intercom. announcing a slight delay for operational adjustments. Camille almost smiled at the irony. The adjustments he was looking for had nothing to do with aerodynamics and everything to do with control. She thought about the summit in Seattle, about the speech she was slated to give on leadership in uncertain times. She'd planned to talk about resilience, about how leaders set the tone for their organizations in moments of stress. And here she was, in a situation that would test her own words. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand, a text from Andre, even though he was just 2 rows away. Andre, you good? Camille, yes. Just deciding which hill is worth the fight. Andre, some hills aren't optional. She glanced over her shoulder just enough to meet his gaze. He gave the smallest nod. That was all. The forward galley curtain moved, and Captain Vance stepped back into the cabin. He walked with the deliberate pace of someone who wanted everyone to see he was in charge. Stopping at Camille's row, he placed one hand lightly on the headrest of the seat in front of her. Dr. Rhodes, he said, I need your cooperation. Camille's tone was calm, even warm, but her words carried weight. Cooperation, Captain, is a two-way street. You have yet to explain why the solution to your so-called balance problem requires moving me instead of anyone else. It's the decision we've made, he said. We need to move forward. She tilted her head slightly. Then I suggest you make sure that decision can withstand the light of day. The captain's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to reply, but something in Camille's steady gaze made him close it again. Without another word, he stepped back toward the cockpit. Elliot let out a quiet laugh, but it sounded less confident than before. Andre reached into the seat pocket in front of him and pulled out his phone. He wasn't recording, not yet, but his thumb hovered over the camera icon. Camille leaned back, her mind already running through the options. She knew there would be more pressure to come, more attempts to frame this as a minor inconvenience. She was blowing out of proportion. But she also knew something else. Once you gave away your place without cause, it became easier for others to take it from you again. And she wasn't about to set that precedent, not here, not today, outside. A jet on the next runway roared into the sky, its shadow sweeping briefly across the cabin. Camille watched it climb, steady and sure, and felt her own resolve mirror its ascent. The hum of the cabin system seemed louder now, filling the silence left in the wake of Captain Vance's retreat. Camille kept her gaze forward, eyes tracing the fine stitching of the leather seat in front of her, while her mind ran through a quiet inventory of the moment. Every detail was a piece of a puzzle: the Carraway's smugness, Marcy's nervous glances, the captain's evasive language. None of it added up to an actual operational need. She could sense that the passengers around her were settling into sides. Some sat stiffly, their eyes fixed on tablets or books, pretending not to notice. Others stole glances toward her row, as if waiting to see which way the current would turn. That tension was familiar to Camille, the way a room holds its breath when power is being tested. A soft rustle came from behind. Sloane Carraway leaned toward Elliot, her voice carrying despite the pretense of discretion. I cannot believe she's dragging this out. This is first class. Not a protest. Elliot chuckled under his breath. Let her play. She'll give in once she realizes she's not in control here. Camille felt the faintest smile tug at her lips, not from amusement, but from recognition. She had sat across tables from men like Elliot, in boardrooms where the stakes were far higher than a seat on a plane. Their mistake was always the same confusing calm with weakness. From 2 rows back, Andre Morales rose from his seat. His movements were slow, deliberate, giving the sense that he was simply stretching his legs. But Camille knew him well enough to see the purpose behind it. He stepped into the aisle, making his way toward her row. "Everything all right?" "Camille." His voice was low, but it carried just enough for the nearby rows to hear. "I'm fine," she said, meeting his gaze. Andre turned to Marcy, who had been watching from the galley. "I think it would be wise to verify the passenger manifest before asking our CEO to move, especially on a chartered flight." Marcy stiffened, her eyes flicking toward the cockpit. "This is the captain's call," she said quickly. Andre's expression didn't change, but his tone cooled. The captain's call still has to align with the contract. And the manifest? A ripple of quiet moved through the cabin. People who had been studiously ignoring the situation now shifted in their seats, looking up from devices. The shift was subtle, but it was there, the atmosphere tilting toward curiosity, even a hint of anticipation. Marcy's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I'll let the captain know you have concerns," she said, retreating toward the cockpit. Camille watched her go, then turned to Andre. "You didn't have to step in yet," she murmured. "Some moments," Andre said, "are better handled before they turn into something worse." Her eyes softened for just a heartbeat. It already is something worse. The minutes that followed were thick with unspoken things. The caraways whispered in that pointed way designed to be overheard. Passengers in the front rows pretended to read while holding their phones just high enough to capture video. In the galley, a muted exchange between Marcy and the captain could be heard, though not clearly enough to make out words. Camille leaned back, considering her next move. She was no stranger to calculated waiting, the kind that could wear down an opponent faster than any raised voice. But she also knew that silence could be dangerous when the other side mistook it for surrender. The cockpit door opened again, and Captain Vance emerged. His stride was brisker this time, his mouth set in a straight line. He stopped beside Camille's seat, one hand resting on the headrest in front of her. "Dr. Rhodes," he said, his voice quieter now. "I've reviewed the seating situation. My crew and I still believe moving you would resolve the balance issue more smoothly." Camille tilted her head slightly. "More smoothly for whom?" The captain hesitated. "It's not about comfort. It's about distribution of weight for takeoff." Andre stepped closer. "Then why not move the passengers behind her? They're in the same section. The manifest clearly shows this seat is assigned to Dr. Rhodes." Elliot spoke up then, his tone dripping with false reason. "We're just trying to make this easy for everyone. Surely she can be flexible." Camille turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "Flexibility is for matters of convenience, Mr. Carroway, not for matters of principle." Sloane gave a soft, incredulous laugh. "Principle. Over a seat." Camille let her gaze return to the captain. "If this is truly about safety, then you will have no trouble explaining to my charter manager why moving me was necessary. Would you like me to connect you now?" There was a pause just long enough for the cabin to feel the balance of power shift. Vance's eyes flicked toward Andre, then toward the passengers watching intently. "That won't be necessary," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. Camille leaned back slightly, her tone even. "Then we have no further issue." The captain stood there for a moment longer, as if weighing whether to push further, before turning back toward the cockpit. As he walked away, the hum of conversation resumed, low but charged. Andre returned to his seat, but not before giving Camille the faintest nod. It was the kind of nod that said the real fight hadn't even begun yet, but they were ready. From behind, Sloane's voice came again, this time edged with frustration. "She's making a scene." "It's embarrassing," Elliot replied in a low growl. "If the crew had any backbone, they'd just make her move." Camille closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words roll over her like water over stone. She thought about the speech she would give in Seattle, about the young professionals in the audience who would be looking to her for examples of courage. Courage didn't always come in the form of grand gestures. Sometimes it was in the quiet refusal to yield when every subtle cue told you to step aside. Her phone rested in her lap, screen dark. She considered picking it up, making the call that would end this standoff in minutes. But there was still value in letting the other side show their hand completely. Through the cabin speakers, Vance's voice announced a brief hold before departure. The reason given was routine, but Camille could hear the tightness beneath it. He knew the situation was no longer confined to a private exchange between crew and passenger. She opened her eyes, glancing at the reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her was composed. Yes, but there was something else in her eyes now. A readiness. The jet bridge door was still open. Ground crew moved outside, going about their duties with practiced rhythm. But inside, the real story was no longer about boarding or baggage or safety. It was about the quiet line that had been drawn in row 2, and the choice of whether to cross it. Camille adjusted her seatbelt, her voice calm as she spoke just loud enough for Andre to hear. "Let's see how far they're willing to take this." He gave a small smile. "My guess too far." Outside, the last rays of sun were dipping below the horizon, and the cabin lights glowed warmer in the dimming light. The stage was set. The next move, Camille knew, would decide more than just the outcome of this flight. Camille sat back against the cool leather of her seat, her hands resting loosely in her lap. The cabin lights had dimmed to a soft amber, and the air was tinged with that faint scent of brewed coffee coming from the galley. She could hear the gentle hiss of the air system, the occasional cough, the rustle of a magazine page being turned somewhere behind her. On the surface, it could have been any other flight preparing for takeoff, but under the calm veneer, the tension was still humming, low and persistent, like an unplayed note waiting to resolve. Her mind drifted in and out of the moment. 1 second. She was here in seat 2O, staring out at the glow of runway lights beginning to pierce the evening sky. The next, she was back in a conference room in London, 10 years younger, listening as a board member explained to her why she would be better suited supporting the presentation rather than delivering it. She remembered the way her throat had tightened, how she'd smiled politely and agreed, even as something inside her had twisted. She thought about the dozens of similar moments, so small they could almost be excused as misunderstandings, but so constant they carved a deep groove in her memory. Being told her assigned hotel suite had been accidentally given to another guest. Being asked for identification 3 times at a corporate gala while others walked in without question. None of it catastrophic on its own, but together they formed a pattern as clear as any chart she had ever analyzed in her career. And now, here she was, once again being asked to move not because of safety, no matter what they claimed, but because someone else wanted her space. She could feel the old temptation to just give in. There was a certain relief in surrender. If she moved, the glares from the caraways would stop, the crew would relax, and the flight could go on. She could land in Seattle, check into her hotel, and prepare for the summit without the headache of conflict hanging over her. But then another voice rose in her mind, her mother's, clear, steady, unyielding. Your seat in life is not given, it's claimed, and if you give it up once, you'll be asked to give it up again. Camille exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly. She thought about the young women who would be in that Seattle conference hall tomorrow. Some would be stepping into leadership roles for the first time. Others would still be fighting for their seat at the table. What would they think if they saw her back down here? What would she think of herself? She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. The motion drew Andre's attention. He tilted his head, silently asking the question his voice didn't need to. "I'm deciding," she said quietly, her tone low enough that only he could hear. Andre gave a single nod. Sometimes the decision makes itself. This isn't one of those times. She knew he was right. The easy road was right there, and so was the harder one. But the harder one was also the one that felt like truth. From behind her, Sloane's voice cut through her thoughts, laced with faux concern. "I just don't understand why she's making this a big deal. It's a seat. She could just move, and we'd all be comfortable." Elliot's reply was quieter, but no less grating. Some people like to make a show out of everything. Camille didn't turn. She didn't respond. Instead, she let their words hang in the air, evidence of the quiet disrespect they didn't even bother to hide. Marcy reappeared in the aisle, approaching with that same brittle smile. "Dr. Rhodes, we really do need to resolve this before we can depart." Camille looked up at her, studying her expression. There was something in Marcy's eyes, a flicker of unease that hadn't been there earlier. Camille wondered if she was starting to realize the precariousness of her position. "I'm not moving," Camille said, her voice soft but final. Marcy opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I'll inform the captain," she said finally, turning back toward the cockpit. As the curtain swished shut behind her, Camille felt the cabin around her shift again. People leaned subtly in her direction, as though waiting for the next chapter in a story they couldn't stop following. Her phone buzzed in her lap. This time it wasn't a text from Andre. It was a reminder for her evening call with Paula Everett, her company's charter contract manager. Camille stared at the screen for a long moment. The answer had been there all along. She didn't have to wait for the captain to decide. She could decide. She tapped the screen, selecting Paula's number. The call connected almost instantly. "Dr. Rhodes." Paula's voice came through, crisp and businesslike. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you until later." "There's been a development," Camille said, keeping her voice low but clear. "The crew is attempting to move me from my assigned seat. They've cited a weight and balance issue. However, the seat next to me is empty, and the passengers they're accommodating are not listed as part of our manifest." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of fingers tapping on a keyboard. "You're on Aero Lux Flight 1823 to Seattle." "Yes." Another pause. "Stay on the line," Paula said, her tone hardening. "Do not agree to anything. I'm contacting the captain now." Camille ended the call and placed the phone on the tray table. She could feel the faint vibration of the engines as the ground crew finished preparations outside, oblivious to the shifting dynamics inside the cabin. Andre leaned forward in his seat, catching her eye. "You called her yes," Camille replied simply. He sat back with a satisfied look. "Good." From the corner of her eye, Camille saw the curtain to the galley shift again. Marcy emerged, her expression tighter, the color in her cheeks a shade darker. She moved toward the cockpit, her steps quick, her posture tense. For the first time since boarding, Camille allowed herself to imagine the possible outcomes. She didn't know yet how this would end, but she knew she had set something in motion, something that couldn't be quietly undone. The hum of the engines deepened, the cabin lights brightening for a moment before settling again. Outside, The last of the daylight was slipping away. The sky over Phoenix a rich gradient of orange and deepening blue. Camille stared at it for a moment, grounding herself in the quiet beauty of it before the next wave hit. She had made her decision. Now she would see it through. The minutes after Camille's call stretched into an unusual quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every sound sharper. A fork clinking against a plate in the galley, the faint squeak of a shoe against the aisle carpet, the hushed buzz of passengers leaning toward one another to whisper, too curious to keep their eyes on their own screens. Andre Morales sat with one leg crossed over the other, watching Camille the way an experienced chess player watches the board after a bold opening move. He knew something was happening behind the scenes now. Whatever conversation Paula Everett was having with the captain, it would not be a comfortable one. The galley curtain shifted. Marcy Lowell stepped out, her smile gone now, replaced by a tightness around the mouth that betrayed stress. She avoided Camille's gaze and went straight to the cockpit. A murmur of voices followed from behind the closed door, low but urgent. Andre leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "They're stalling," he said in a low voice. Camille kept her eyes on the window. "It won't matter. Paula won't stall. Almost on cue." The intercom clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Vance's voice said, "we're experiencing a short delay before departure. Thank you for your patience." The words were neutral, but the tone was different, now flatter, less certain. Andre unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. He walked down the aisle slowly, deliberately, pausing at Camille's row. "Excuse me, Captain." He called toward the cockpit door. "Before you continue with this delay, you might want to address the fact that you're attempting to relocate a passenger whose company paid for this charter. I'd advise checking the manifest before you go further." A couple of passengers glanced up at that. One man across the aisle raised his eyebrows and muttered something under his breath. The cockpit door opened part way, and Captain Vance leaned out. His face was composed, but there was a strain in his eyes. "Sir, this is an operational matter." Andre didn't move. "Operational matters are still subject to contract terms. You're breaching them right now." The captain's jaw tightened. "Please take your seat." Andre held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You'll want to remember this moment," he said, before returning to his seat. Camille hadn't moved during the exchange. She sat with her back straight, her hands loosely clasped in her lap, but inside, she could feel the cabin tilting further in her direction. Every word Andre had spoken was a reminder to the crew and to the watching passengers that this wasn't a random passenger resisting instructions. This was a charter leader being publicly challenged without cause. The Carraways, however, seemed undeterred. Elliot leaned forward, resting an elbow on his knee so he could speak over Camille's shoulder. "You could make this so much easier. You know, just move for the flight. No one will think less of you." Camille didn't turn. "It's not about what they think of me," she said, her voice low but certain. "It's about what I think of myself." Sloane let out a small laugh. "Dramatic." From the front of the cabin, Marcy reappeared, her posture stiff. She approached Camille's row again, but there was no authority in her expression this time. "Dr. Rhodes, Captain Vance would still like your cooperation, and I would like his explanation," Camille said. "In writing." Marcy's mouth opened, then closed again. "I'll let him know." She walked away quickly, disappearing into the cockpit once more. Andre turned slightly in his seat, speaking just loudly enough for the nearby rows to hear. "If anyone here is wondering, the seat Dr. Rhodes's inn was assigned to her company under a signed charter contract. This isn't about safety. That landed like a quiet bell in the cabin. The murmuring grew, subtle but unmistakable. A man in 1C looked back, his brow furrowed. A woman in 3A shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Camille and the cockpit. The air was changing. Camille could feel it too. This was no longer just a standoff between her and the crew. It was becoming a question the whole cabin was starting to ask themselves. Why were they trying to move her? And if it wasn't about safety, then what was it? The answer hung unspoken, but it was there. Her phone buzzed on the tray table. She glanced down to see Paula's name again. "Dr. Rhodes," Paula's voice came through, crisp and clipped. "I've just informed Captain Vance that any further attempts to move you will constitute a breach of contract. If this continues, I will instruct them to halt departure entirely." Camille's lips curved slightly. "Understood." "I'm also reviewing the manifest now," Paula continued. "The Caraway passengers are not on it." Camille's eyes flicked briefly toward the couple behind her. "Noted." When she ended the call, she sat a little straighter. Andre caught her eye and gave the smallest of nods. The pieces were aligning. Marcy came down the aisle again, but this time her steps were slower, her eyes darting toward other passengers' phones. People weren't even pretending to hide their recording anymore. She stopped beside Camille. "The captain says we can revisit the seating arrangement after departure." "No," Camille said simply. "We'll address it now." Marcy swallowed hard and walked back toward the front. Andre leaned over. "They're out of moves." "Not yet," Camille replied. "They'll try one more push. People like this always do. As if on cue." The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be making a brief announcement at the gate before we proceed." The jet bridge door opened, and a gate agent stepped in. She was holding a tablet and wearing an expression Camille recognized instantly, the look of someone who had just been told bad news they'd have to deliver. "Mr. and Mrs. Caraway," she called. Sloane's head snapped up. "Yes, may I see your boarding passes?" "Please." Elliot handed them over with a confident smile. The agent scanned them, then frowned. "These are for Flight 1823, dated yesterday." The Caraways froze. "That can't be right," Sloane said quickly. "We were told I'm afraid these are not valid for today's flight," the agent said. "You'll need to collect your belongings and deplane." Elliot's voice rose, sharp. "We have important business in Seattle. You can't just—" "This is a chartered flight," the agent interrupted firmly. "And you are not authorized passengers." The cabin erupted in low chatter. Someone in 3C whispered, "Are you kidding me?" A phone camera zoomed in on the exchange. Andre looked at Camille, a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. And there it is. Camille didn't move, didn't gloat. She simply sat still as the Caraways began gathering their things in angry, jerky motions. Sloane muttered something under her breath that Camille didn't bother to catch. The agent stepped aside to let them pass. As they moved toward the door, Elliot shot Camille a glare that could have cut glass. She met it evenly, her expression unreadable. When they were gone, the cabin seemed to exhale. Andre leaned back in his seat, folding his hands. "What's the saying? Give them enough rope." Camille allowed herself a faint smile. "Something like that." Outside, the jet bridge door closed again, but Camille knew the flight wasn't moving forward yet, not until the captain decided how to handle the fact that his chosen passengers weren't even supposed to be here. And somewhere in the background, she knew Paula Everett was still on the line, waiting for his answer. The jet bridge door had barely closed behind the Caraways when the cabin settled into a strange kind of anticipation. People weren't returning to their books or screens. They were leaning back in their seats but keeping their eyes forward, as if they knew the story wasn't over yet. Phones stayed poised in hands, ready to record. The low hum of the ventilation filled the air, punctuated by the occasional creak of the fuselage as the evening air cooled. Camille sat still, her posture composed, eyes on the aisle ahead of her. She could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about her anymore. The Caraways had been removed, but the crew had yet to acknowledge what had happened or why. The captain hadn't addressed her directly since Andre's intervention, and that, she knew, meant they were hoping to quietly proceed as if nothing had happened. Her phone vibrated again. Paula Everett's name lit up the screen. Camille answered on the first ring. "Dr. Rhodes." Paula's voice came through with a clipped efficiency. "The removal of those passengers confirms a clear breach in boarding protocol. I have already informed Captain Vance that Aerolux is in violation of our charter agreement." And Camille asked, her voice even, "And I am instructing him to hold the aircraft at the gate until I say otherwise." Paula replied, "If you wish, I can escalate further and cancel this departure entirely." Camille's gaze didn't waver from the aisle. "Do it." There was no hesitation on the other end. "Consider it done." She ended the call and placed the phone neatly back on the tray table. Andre, watching her, raised an eyebrow. She answered his silent question with a single word. "Grounded." The cockpit door opened, and Captain Vance stepped into the cabin. His eyes scanned the rows before landing on Camille. He didn't speak right away, and she could see the tightness around his jaw. "Dr. Rhodes," he began, "I've been informed by your charter manager that this flight will not be departing." Camille finished for him. Her voice was calm, but there was no give in it. His lips pressed into a thin line. "There are other passengers aboard who will be accommodated on a different aircraft," she said. "This one is under contract to my company. That contract was violated. The decision has been made." From the second row across the aisle, a woman let out a soft, audible wow. Someone else whispered, "She's not playing." Captain Vance's eyes flicked toward the recording phones. The awareness of being documented was settling in now, tightening the lines of his expression. He gave a short nod, then turned on his heel and disappeared back into the cockpit. The cabin stayed quiet for a beat, and then Andre leaned forward, his voice pitched just for Camille. "You know, you've just turned this into a story people will be talking about for months." Camille kept her eyes on the front of the cabin. "Good. Some stories are worth telling." Marcy appeared again, her movements more hesitant now. She lingered at the edge of Camille's row, as if unsure whether to speak. "Dr. Rhodes," she said finally, "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just following." "Following orders doesn't absolve responsibility," Camille said, her tone still quiet, but now edged with a firmness that made Marcy look down at her shoes. "I understand," Marcy murmured, before moving toward the galley. A murmur began in the back rows. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Passengers trading observations, piecing together the sequence of events. Someone mentioned the Caraways' outdated boarding passes. Another commented on how quickly the removal had happened once the gate agent got involved. The mood had shifted. Curiosity had given way to something closer to solidarity. Andre checked his watch. "If Paula has grounded us, they'll be sending another aircraft soon. This crew won't be on it." Camille nodded once. "That's the point." The intercom crackled again. But this time it wasn't the captain. It was the gate agent's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to operational changes, this aircraft will not be departing. Please collect your belongings and return to the terminal. Aerolux representatives will assist you with rebooking or alternate transportation." A low wave of reaction swept through the cabin, groans from a few, but mostly hushed commentary. The passengers began rising from their seats, pulling bags from overhead bins. Camille remained seated until the flow of people had thinned. As she stood, Andre stepped into the aisle beside her. "Ready always," she said. They moved together toward the front of the cabin. As she passed the galley, Camille caught Marcy's eye. The flight attendant's face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Camille didn't stop, didn't speak. She simply met her gaze for a moment before stepping onto the jet bridge. The air in the terminal was cooler, with the faint smell of fast food from a kiosk nearby. Clusters of passengers from the flight stood together, talking in low voices. Some gave Camille quick nods as she passed. Others simply watched her with a mix of curiosity and respect. At the far end of the gate area, 2 Aerolux managers stood with Paula Everett on a video call, her face crisp on the tablet screen. One of the managers looked visibly uncomfortable, the other trying to keep a professional mask in place. "Dr. Rhodes," Paula's voice came through. "I'll be arranging an alternate aircraft for you and your team. And as for this incident, rest assured, it will be addressed at the highest levels." Camille inclined her head slightly. "Thank you." Andre glanced at her. "You just sent a message that will echo far past this gate." "That's the idea," she said. They turned to walk toward the private lounge, leaving behind the hum of conversations, the flash of phone cameras, and the quiet knowledge that what had happened here would not be forgotten. By the time Camille and Andre reached the private lounge, her phone was already buzzing with incoming notifications. Some were from company executives checking in, others from friends who had seen the incident unfolding online. Word was traveling fast, faster than she had anticipated. The lounge was quieter than the terminal, with plush seating, warm lighting, and the faint scent of citrus in the air. Camille set her carry-on beside one of the armchairs and sank into it, exhaling slowly. Andre sat opposite her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You've been trending for the last 20 minutes, he said, glancing down at his own phone. Hashtag not your seat. Passengers from the flight posted videos. Some already have thousands of views." Camille reached for her water glass and took a measured sip. The truth has a way of finding its audience. Andre smiled faintly. "So does injustice." She nodded, thinking of the videos. Strangers with smartphones had captured every beat the confrontation. The caraway's removal, the captain's unwillingness to answer simple questions. Those clips, stripped of any corporate spin, would speak for themselves. Her phone rang. Paula Everett's name appeared again. Camille answered immediately. "Dr. Rhodes," Paula said, her tone sharper now. "The videos are already being flagged by major outlets. Aerolux's PR team has reached out to me. They're trying to get ahead of it." And Camille asked, "And I told them you'll be speaking directly with their board before any settlement or statement is issued." Andre's eyebrows lifted at that. Camille met his gaze, then said into the phone, "Good. Keep it that way." Paula paused. "Also, I've reviewed the incident with our legal team. We're categorizing this as a contractual breach and discriminatory conduct. That combination gives us leverage." Camille's fingers drummed lightly against the armrest. "Leverage is useful, but only if it leads to change. That's your call," Paula said. "I can put together terms that force policy revisions, training requirements, and personnel reviews. Do it, Camille said. They ended the call. Andre leaned back in his seat, a look of quiet admiration on his face. You're playing this perfectly. Not just winning the fight, but shaping the field for the next one. She gave him a small, almost tired smile. You don't get many chances to draw a line like this. When you do, you make it count. Outside the lounge's frosted glass wall, the terminal bustled on. Passengers streamed past, some casting glances inside when they recognized her. A few offered quick nods of encouragement through the glass. One man stopped just long enough to mouth the words, "Thank you," before moving on. It was a simple thing, but it landed. Camille felt the weight of it, the unspoken acknowledgement from someone who understood what it meant to refuse to move when moving was expected. Her thoughts drifted back to the cabin. She remembered the way Marcy's eyes had darted away, the uncertainty in her voice toward the end. She thought of the captain's clipped tone when he realized he was being recorded. She could almost hear the calculations they were making in real time, the way people do when they realize their authority is no longer absolute. Andre broke the silence. So, what's next? Camille looked down at her phone, scrolling through the notifications. News blogs were already writing quick summaries based on passenger posts. Some headlines leaned toward the dramatic, others toward the factual. One read Black CEO refuses to move for unauthorized passengers. Flight grounded. Another not your seat trends. After first-class standoff. She looked up. Next, we wait. The public pressure will build. And when it peaks, that's when we step in with our terms. Andre tilted his head. And if they try to get ahead of us, then we make sure they trip over their own story, Camille said. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from her social media account. Without posting anything herself, her name had been tagged in dozens of posts. Screenshots of her sitting calmly in seat 2A, clips of Andre challenging the captain, photos of the caraways being escorted out. The momentum was no longer in the crew's hands, or even in Aerolux's. It belonged to the narrative forming in real time online. Camille leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other. They'll have to decide quickly whether they want to be part of the solution or the example. Andre's smile widened. My money's on the example. The lounge attendant approached, her professional composure not quite masking the flicker of recognition in her eyes. Dr. Rhodes, your replacement aircraft will be ready in 40 minutes. Aerolux has arranged for a new crew. Thank you, Camille said, her voice warm but measured. As the attendant walked away, Andre's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then let out a low whistle. CNN just picked it up. Camille didn't flinch. Then it's already too late for them to bury it. She sat quietly for a moment, letting the truth of that settle in. She had been here before, not in a lounge after grounding a flight, but in moments where the balance of power shifted unexpectedly in her favor. The challenge was never in seizing that moment. It was in deciding what to do with it. Her thoughts returned to the summit in Seattle, the speech she was to give about leadership in uncertain times. It felt almost too aligned now, as if the events of the day had been a prelude. She would stand before that audience with a fresh example of what it meant to lead without raising your voice, to claim space without apology. Andre's voice cut into her thoughts again. They're not going to recover from this cleanly. They don't need to, she said. They just need to learn from it, or be replaced. He studied her for a moment. You really think they'll change? Camille met his eyes. I don't expect change because it's the right thing to do. I expect it because not changing will cost them more than they can afford. The hum of the lounge air system filled the pause that followed. Outside, the terminal's intercom announced boarding for another flight. Life moved on for everyone else. But here, the weight of the day was still settling into place. Camille checked the time. 40 minutes until departure. 40 minutes until the conversation shifted again. She thought about the passengers who had watched her refuse to move, about the people online who would never meet her but would carry the image of a black woman holding her ground in first class. She thought about the ones who had been in similar situations and given in, and about those who might choose differently next time because they saw her sit still. And she knew, without question, that the tipping point had already passed. The rest was just momentum. By the time the replacement aircraft was ready, Camille's phone was a wall of notifications, mentions, tags, direct messages from people she hadn't heard from in years. Some sent congratulations. Others sent screenshots of news headlines. The story had jumped from social media chatter to breaking news on major outlets in less than an hour. As she and Andre stepped into the jet bridge for the new flight, 2 passengers from the original plane stopped them. One, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair, clasped Camille's hand briefly. "I was in row 4, she said softly. "Thank you for not moving. I've been there before. I wish I had done what you did." Camille squeezed her hand. "Next time, you will." The woman smiled, her eyes bright with something like relief, and let go. Inside the new aircraft, the atmosphere was different. The crew greeted her with professional warmth, their smiles genuine. There was no edge in their voices, no nervous glances. It felt like a return to normalcy, but Camille knew the normal had shifted. Andre took the seat beside her this time. "No empty buffer zone for you," he said with a faint grin. "Good," she replied. "I prefer allies within reach." The engines hummed as the last passengers boarded. Camille looked out the window at the glow of the tarmac lights. Somewhere back in the terminal, Aerolux's leadership team was no doubt scrambling. The videos had already reached millions of views. The hashtag #NotYourSeat had been joined by others. Stand your ground. Fly with respect. Public opinion was hardening fast. Her phone rang again. This time it was not Paula. The caller ID read unknown number, but Camille had a sense of who it might be. She answered. "Dr. Rhodes," a man's voice began, formal but strained. "This is Jonathan Hale, interim COO of Aerolux Air. I want to personally apologize for what happened on Flight 1823. Camille's tone was polite, but there was no mistaking the firmness in it. "Mr. Hale, an apology is a starting point, but I think you know we're well past that." "Yes," he said quickly. "We are prepared to meet any reasonable demands to ensure this never happens again." "Reasonable," Camille repeated. "I'm sure our definitions differ. Here's mine: public acknowledgement of misconduct. Immediate review of crew training and passenger verification procedures. And a binding commitment to diversity and anti-bias programs within 6 months." There was a pause. "That's a significant list." "That's the floor," Camille said. "Not the ceiling." Hale exhaled audibly. "I'll have our legal and PR teams reach out to you and your charter manager. I hope we can resolve this quickly." You can resolve it effectively," she corrected. "Quickly is your concern, not mine." She ended the call and set the phone down. Andre raised an eyebrow. "You didn't leave much room for negotiation." "I left exactly as much as they've earned," Camille replied. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, the vibration beneath them steady and strong. Camille let her eyes close for a moment, listening to the rising pitch of the engines. It was a familiar rhythm, one she usually found calming. Tonight, it felt like a line being drawn further across the sand. At cruising altitude, the Wi-Fi connection filled her phone with fresh updates. News anchors were dissecting passenger videos, playing them on split screens alongside statements from aviation analysts. Clips of her sitting quietly, refusing to move, were being slowed down, analyzed for every gesture and expression. Some commentators praised her composure. Others debated the implications of grounding a flight over such an incident. One headline caught her eye: "The woman in 2-0. When saying no changes the flight plan." Andre leaned over. "They're framing you as the central figure in this story. That's power, but it's also pressure. I've carried both before," she said. Her email pinged with a message from Paula. Attached was a draft of the contractual terms they intended to present to Aerolux. It was clean, precise, and unapologetically firm. Camille scrolled through it slowly, the language crisp and the deadline short. She handed the phone to Andre. "Thoughts?" He skimmed it and nodded. "They'll resist the training requirements, but with public opinion where it is, they'll have no choice." Camille smiled faintly. "That's the point." Halfway through the flight, the cabin lights dimmed. Outside, the world below was a scatter of city lights beneath a deep midnight sky. Camille thought about the people on the ground, many of them scrolling through the same videos, forming their opinions in real time. She thought about the crew of the first flight Marcy, with her brittle smile, and Captain Vance, with his clipped tone. She wondered what they were thinking now, whether they realized just how far the ripples from their actions would travel. Andre broke the quiet. "When this is over, do you think they'll understand why you didn't move?" Camille's gaze stayed on the darkness outside. "Understanding isn't required. Change is." By the time they landed in Seattle, her phone had reached the point where the battery warning flashed red. As she and Andre stepped into the cool night air, a small group of people near the gate turned their heads. She heard someone whisper, "That's her," followed by the faint sound of a camera shutter. Outside the terminal, a car waited to take them to the hotel. As the driver loaded their bags, Camille's phone buzzed one more time. It was a message from an unknown number. "You made me proud tonight. Former passenger, row 5. She read it twice before sliding the phone into her bag. It was a simple line, but it was enough to remind her why she had stayed seated. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. Camille stepped into the car, feeling the quiet satisfaction of someone who had not only held her ground, but shifted the ground beneath others. Tomorrow, she knew, the real work would begin. Tonight, she allowed herself the space to simply be still. The next morning in Seattle, the city was waking to a soft drizzle. From her hotel suite's floor-to-ceiling windows, Camille could see the gray sweep of the bay, ferries gliding across the water, and the faint outline of mountains in the distance. She stood there for a moment, letting the quiet steady her. Today would not be quiet for long. Andre was already at the small dining table, laptop open, coffee in hand. He didn't look up when he spoke. "It's starting." Camille crossed the room, glancing at his screen. The news ticker on a major network read "Aerolux suspends. Crew following charter incident." Beneath it, a split screen showed Paula Everett speaking to a reporter on one side and a loop of the now famous video clip on the other. "They moved fast," Camille said. Andre nodded. "They had to. Public pressure is peaking. Marcy Lowell has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Captain Vance has been suspended from flight duty. Camille felt no satisfaction, only inevitability. And the Carraways' Andre clicked to another tab. Their names are trending for all the wrong reasons. Turns out Elliot's company just lost a contract renewal not directly because of this, but the optics didn't help. Sloane's charity board quietly removed her from the roster. The coffee smelled rich and bitter. Camille poured herself a cup, adding just enough cream to soften the edge. "This is what happens when people think there are no consequences," she said. "They act without thinking about the cost." Andre leaned back, studying her. "They're not just reacting to you grounding the flight. They're reacting to the fact that you didn't let it fade away. You've kept the narrative focused on the systemic part of it." She sipped her coffee. "Because it's never about just one incident. If it were, we wouldn't be here." Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Paula board meeting at 11 Pacific. "They want you present via conference call. I'll send the secure link." Camille typed back, "I'll be there." By mid-morning, she was seated at the desk in her suite, the video call open on her laptop. The Aerolux board members appeared in neat rows, their backgrounds ranging from polished home offices to corporate conference rooms. Jonathan Hale was there, too, looking like a man who hadn't slept. "Dr. Rhodes," the chairwoman began, "we want to formally apologize on behalf of the company. The events on Flight 1823 were unacceptable, and we take full responsibility." Camille inclined her head slightly. "Acknowledgement is a start, but I'm not interested in apologies without action." Hale jumped in. "We've reviewed the terms your office sent, the training requirements, passenger verification protocols, and diversity benchmarks. They're ambitious, but we're prepared to implement them." "Prepared to," Camille repeated. "Or committed to." The chairwoman's voice was steady. "Committed." Camille let the word hang for a moment before she spoke again. "Then you'll have no problem making those commitments public. In writing." A murmur of assent moved through the group. Paula, who had joined the call on her end, began outlining the timeline for implementation. Camille listened, interjecting only to clarify or reinforce key points. When the call ended 40 minutes later, the commitments were locked in. Andre closed his laptop with a quiet click. "That's one chapter finished." "Not finished," Camille said. "Just written." She spent the early afternoon preparing for the summit, her keynote now subtly reshaped by the events of the last 48 hours. The theme was still leadership in uncertain times, but now she had a fresh, visceral example to draw from. At the event hall, the energy was electric. Word of the incident had spread through the business community, and many attendees were eager to hear her perspective. Backstage, the event coordinator greeted her with a knowing smile. "We've had more press requests for you in the last day than for the entire conference combined." Camille adjusted the microphone clip to her lapel. "Let's give them something worth writing about." When she stepped onto the stage, the applause was immediate and sustained. She began not with the details of the flight, but with the principle at its core, the idea that respect is not situational, and dignity is not negotiable. She spoke about the quiet pressure to yield, about the moments when doing nothing would be easier, but doing something would be necessary. "You will be told, in one way or another, that you are in the wrong place," she said, her voice steady over the auditorium's hush. "And when that happens, you have a choice to move for someone else's comfort, or to stay for your own truth." The standing ovation at the end was not for the speech alone, but for the stand she had taken days before. She knew it, and she knew that message would outlast the trending hashtags. Back at the hotel that evening, Camille finally allowed herself to sit in the quiet. The city lights shimmered on the bay. The rain had stopped, and the air felt clean. Andre knocked once before stepping in, holding a printout. "It's official," he said. "Aerolux just issued a public statement outlining every commitment you demanded. It's on their website. It's on the news. And it's already being dissected online." Camille read the first lines. The language was corporate, but the commitments were clear. Training programs, policy reforms, accountability measures. She set the paper down. Good. Now they have to live up to it. Andre gave a wry smile. "And if they don't, then we remind them," she said simply. The hum of the city outside filled the room. Camille picked up her coffee cup from that morning, now cold, and set it aside. Some victories didn't come with celebration. Some came with the knowledge that you had shifted the ground, even if only a little, and sometimes that was enough. Seattle was still gray and damp the morning after the summit, but the mood in Camille's suite was lighter. She stood at the window again, coffee in hand, watching gulls cut through the mist over the bay. Andre was on the couch with his tablet, scrolling through the latest headlines. "They're calling it the Rhodes Accord now," he said without looking up. "The whole package of policy changes. Aerolux is already pushing press releases, saying they're industry-leading." Camille arched an eyebrow. Yesterday they were avoiding the word policy entirely. "That was yesterday," Andre said, swiping to another article. "Today, they've realized that owning the story is cheaper than fighting it." Her phone buzzed, a message from Paula. "You should know that other carriers are already reaching out for guidance on similar reforms. This isn't staying inside Aerolux." Camille smiled faintly. The reach was growing faster than she'd hoped. She sat on the edge of the armchair, setting her mug on the table. Change is contagious when it's good for business. By mid-morning, she was on a conference call with a consortium of airline executives and industry regulators. It had been set up in haste, the result of calls Paula had fielded through the night. Camille spoke calmly, outlining the principles behind the new protocols: clear boarding verification, crew accountability, and mandatory anti-bias training. The questions came rapid fire at first, defensive and skeptical, but she answered each without raising her voice. By the end, the tone had shifted. One executive said, "We can either wait until this hits us or start fixing it now." "That," Camille replied, "is the difference between damage control and leadership." When the call ended, Andre grinned at her from across the room. "You just turned one airline's PR nightmare into an industry seminar." The day moved in waves. Interviews with national outlets, a quiet lunch with Paula to finalize oversight measures, a call with her own board to discuss expanding their corporate advocacy arm. Everywhere she turned, the same pattern repeated. The incident on Flight 1823 had cracked something open, and people were rushing to either close the gap or step through it. That afternoon, she stopped by a small cafe near the waterfront. It was the first time she'd been out alone since the summit. The barista, a young woman with dark curls pulled into a bun, handed her a cappuccino with a shy smile. "I saw the video," she said. "My aunt's been a flight attendant for 20 years. She says thank you." Camille held her gaze. "Tell her she's welcome, and tell her she has the power to change things from the inside." Back in her suite that evening, Camille reviewed the latest reports from Paula. Aerolux had suspended Marcy Lowell without pay, pending the outcome of the investigation. Captain Vance had been removed from all active duty and placed on review by the FAA. The Caraways had gone silent. Their social media accounts were either locked or deleted. Andre joined her at the desk, scanning the documents over her shoulder. "That's as close to closure as you'll get from them." "Closure isn't the goal," Camille said. "Prevention is." The city lights reflected off the bay as she spoke, and she thought of the passengers on that first flight, the ones who had watched, recorded, whispered. She wondered if they'd carry the image of her sitting in 2A, the way she carried the memory of that seat. She hoped so. Tomorrow she would fly again, and the world would be watching. But tonight, she let herself breathe in the stillness, knowing that sometimes the real aftershock isn't the noise. Right after the quake, it's the quiet that comes when people realize the ground has shifted beneath them for good. The rain had returned by morning, a soft, steady curtain against the windows of Camille's suite. She sat alone at the small table near the glass, watching the droplets weave paths down the pane. The city outside was blurred, its colors muted. It felt like the perfect backdrop for thinking, and that was all she wanted to do before her next flight. Andre was out meeting with a few contacts, leaving her in rare silence. She wrapped her hands around a mug of tea instead of coffee this time, the steam carrying a faint scent of mint. It grounded her. Her mind drifted to the moment she'd refused to move in seat 2A. She could still feel the texture of the leather under her fingertips, still hear the low hum of the cabin. The memory was sharp, but it was the undercurrent that stayed with her most, the feeling of standing still while every cue told her to yield. She thought about the years of moments that had led to that one, being the only black woman in the boardroom, measured not just by her performance, but by how approachable she seemed. Hearing colleagues praised for being assertive while she was cautioned to be less intense. Even the countless subtle slights in everyday life, the raised eyebrows, the second glances, the mistaken assumptions. It had always been easier to choose peace over confrontation, to avoid being labeled as difficult, but easy wasn't always right. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Simple and to the point, "Proud of you. You stayed seated for all of us." Camille read it twice before setting the phone back down. That was the core of it, wasn't it? The seat had been hers in name, but the choice to stay had been for far more than herself. The quiet was broken by the sound of her laptop chiming with a new email. It was from a young professional she'd met briefly at a conference 2 years ago. The subject line read, "Your flight changed my career." She clicked it open. "Dr. Rhodes," it began. "I watched the video of you on Flight 1823. I saw how calm you were. I've been in situations like that in my own company, and I've always moved aside, thinking it wasn't worth the fight. Seeing you stay made me realize it is worth it. I handed in a proposal yesterday for a project I've been told I wasn't ready for, and it was approved this morning. Thank you for showing me how to stay in my seat." Camille leaned back, letting the words sink in. She imagined the sender at their desk, sliding that proposal across to a supervisor, maybe with a quiet tremor in their hands, but a steadiness in their eyes. Her thoughts shifted to the summit. She had spoken about leadership under pressure, but now she saw the truth more clearly. Leadership wasn't just about guiding others when they looked to you. It was about holding a line when no one else could or would. It was about making choices in the small, personal moments that echoed louder than any speech could. The rain eased, and light began to filter through the clouds. The bay brightened, the water turning from slate to silver. Camille felt something loosen in her chest. She decided to take a walk before her afternoon flight. Outside, the air was crisp and damp. She strolled along the waterfront, the scent of salt water mixing with the faint aroma of roasted coffee from nearby cafes. A few people recognized her, offering nods or quiet words of thanks as she passed. At one corner, she stopped to watch a group of school children on a field trip. They clustered near a bronze statue, their teacher pointing out details. One girl noticed Camille and waved shyly. Camille waved back, thinking about how early the world starts teaching us where we belong and how important it is to unteach those lessons when they're wrong. Back at the hotel, Andre was waiting in the lobby. "Ready for round 2, he asked as they walked toward the car. "I'm ready for whatever comes," she said. On the way to the airport, her phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. Aerolux had just announced the creation of an independent oversight panel to ensure compliance with their new policies. They were calling it the Rhodes Standard. Andre read over her shoulder and grinned. "They're not just adopting your terms. They're branding them with your name." Camille didn't smile right away. Names fade, standards last. At the airport, she moved through security with ease, though she could feel eyes on her. Some passengers seemed to recognize her from the news. Others simply glanced in passing. On the jet bridge, a flight attendant greeted her warmly, her tone without any trace of pretense. Once seated, Camille looked out at the tarmac. She knew she would carry the events of Flight 1823 for the rest of her life, not as a story of conflict, but as a reminder of what happened when she refused to shrink. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and she felt the familiar pull of the plane beginning to push back from the gate. A thought crossed her mind. Simple but solid. Sometimes the most important journeys start when you decide not to move at all. The late afternoon sun hung low over the city when Camille stepped off her return flight, her carry-on rolling quietly over the polished floor of the terminal. She had just come from a board meeting for her own company, where the conversation had turned inevitably to the events on Flight 1823. Even among seasoned executives, there was an unmistakable energy in the room, a recognition that something had shifted. Andre walked beside her, matching her pace. "You've been on 3 flights since then, and not one issue," he said, a faint smile in his voice. "People are paying attention," she replied. "That's enough to change behavior, at least for now." As they passed through the terminal, a few travelers recognized her. A young man in a navy hoodie gave her a nod, and an older woman reached out lightly to touch her arm as she walked by. "I saw what you did," she said softly. "It mattered." Camille thanked her and kept moving. But the words stayed with her. It mattered. That was why she had stayed seated. That was why she had let the confrontation play out instead of stepping aside for convenience. Outside the terminal, the air was warm, carrying the scent of sun-baked asphalt and jet fuel. Their car was waiting, the driver holding the door open. Camille paused before getting in, looking back at the glass facade of the airport. In those windows, she saw travelers streaming in and out, each of them with a destination, each with their own small battles to fight or avoid. She slid into the back seat and pulled out her phone. Paula had sent her the final draft of Aerolux's public commitments, now live on their website and shared across major media outlets. They included every term Camille had insisted on: comprehensive crew training, independent oversight, stricter passenger verification, and a public reporting mechanism for discrimination complaints. Andre glanced over as she scrolled. "They're locked in. You got everything." Camille closed the document and set her phone down. "I didn't get everything, but I got enough to make the next time harder for them." Traffic was slow, leaving the airport, through the window. She watched planes taking off against the setting sun, their wings catching the last light of day. The sight was familiar, almost comforting, but it carried a new layer now. She knew she would never look at an aircraft without remembering the weight of that leather seat under her, the quiet in the cabin, the moment she decided not to move. Her mind drifted to the people she'd heard from in the days since the young professional who had submitted a proposal, despite being told she wasn't ready. The flight attendant's aunt who had worked 20 years without once seeing her airline commit to real bias training. The man in the lounge who had mouthed "thank you" through the glass. These were the real outcomes, more lasting than the headlines. The car pulled up to her building. Camille stepped out, thanking the driver before heading inside. In the elevator, she stood alone, the soft hum of the cables rising with her. She thought about her mother's text. "You stayed seated for all of us," and felt the truth of it settle deeper in her. Inside her apartment, she poured a glass of water and walked to the window. The city stretched out before her, lights beginning to spark on in the dusk. Somewhere beyond those lights, someone else was being told to move, to yield, to make themselves smaller for someone else's comfort. And somewhere, someone else was refusing. She thought about how change often came slowly, unevenly, pushed forward not by grand gestures, but by small, stubborn acts. Staying in your seat, asking the extra question, saying no when yes would be easier. Her phone buzzed with a notification a news outlet had run an op-ed titled, "Respect is not a seat upgrade." She smiled at the phrasing. It was sharp, direct, and true. She picked up her notebook from the desk and wrote a single line. Leadership is choosing the harder right over the easier wrong, even when you are the only one who knows you're doing it. The night deepened outside, the city alive with its quiet hum. Camille set down her pen and turned off the lamp. The work was not finished. Work like this never was, but she had drawn a line, and the echo of it would travel far beyond her own life. Tomorrow, the news cycle might move on. The hashtags might fade, but somewhere, someone would remember the woman in seat 2A, the one who stayed, and they might find their own reason not to move. She stood at the window for a long moment more, the reflection of the city lights in the glass framing her face. Then, softly, she said to herself, "Respect isn't given by the seat you're in. It's carried in the way you refuse to give it up." And with that, she turned away from the glass, ready for whatever the next journey might bring. Sometimes, change doesn't come from grand speeches or sweeping laws. Sometimes, it comes from a single act of stillness, a refusal to move when the world expects you to yield. Dr. Camille Rhodes stayed in her seat, and in doing so, she shifted the balance of more than just an airplane. She forced a company to confront its bias, made an industry rethink its policies, and reminded all of us that respect is not a privilege to be granted. It is a right to be defended. But for every Camille, there are countless others who've been moved, silenced, or erased without witness or consequence. We owe it to them and to ourselves to challenge the quiet injustices that happen every day. Carry this story with you. Let it be a reminder that even the smallest act of courage can echo far beyond its moment. And the next time someone tries to tell you where you don't belong, remember seat 2A. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you real stories that inspire change and demand respect. Your voice helps us reach more hearts, and together, we can make sure no one is ever told to move again.